Dr. Dina Dye here with Foundations in Torah. Welcome to this week's Torah portion, Bahar, which means on the mountain or in the mountain. And as I've been doing with many of the Torah portions, I'm looking at it from the context of a temple, a place for the presence of God. And so the mountain comes to represent this. In the ancient cultures, I've talked about this a number of times, what happens is that as the world, if you will, is covered with water, that represented enemies, raging water, floods, rivers, etc. And when the water is pushed back and dry land appears, it means those enemies were defeated. And what we see come forth is dry ground, and on the dry ground is sort of what we call the primordial hillock. And that dry ground and that hillock eventually becomes a mountain. So mountains were synonymous with temples. This was true in Israel, and this was true in the ancient Near East as well. So what we have is after the enemies have been pushed back and defeated, that is our definition of rest. We see in Genesis chapter 1, going back to that, in the beginning, we go through the entire chapter, we see a temple building process. So 6 days was always associated with construction and a particular type of work. In this case, the work was called melacha. And that basically meant to construct a temple or a tabernacle or a place for the God if it was in the ancient Near East world, and for our God in our economy. And so now that in the 6 days the temple is basically finished, and on the 7th it is dedicated, and that is when the king would take his throne. He would be enthroned. So rest is equated with enemies defeated and the king taking possession of the throne and ruling and reigning from that point. And this is our 6 days and our 7. And we see this exact pattern now in Bahar with Moses and God instructing him. So on the 7th, whether it's 7 days, 7 years, 70 years, 7,000 years, whatever, the idea of 7 and 7 years has to do with the dedication of the temple and the rest that comes. So now here we see that the land was to rest every 7 years. And so the land, there was a year, it was the year of release. Everything was the release of debts, if you will. So the land became synonymous with the temple. So yes, the temple is a building, but it's also the place for the presence of God. The temple and the cosmos were one and the same. The temple and Jerusalem were one and the same. The temple and the land of Israel were one and the same, because that's the place of the presence of God. And so this rest would come because enemies have been defeated, and God then rules and reigns. So every 7 years we have the Shemittah, which means to withdraw. Of course, we know there's no planting and sowing and reaping and harvesting and pruning, etc. But the idea, again, relates to the temple and the place of the presence of God and where he rules and reigns from. So again, 6 years was building language, 7 meant rest. And now on the 7th day, or the 7th year, we have a different kind of work. We had the work melacha, which was construction. Now we have a term for work avodah, which is service. And so we know that the garden came to represent the land, and in the garden, Adam, who served as high priest, now performed the service. So when the temple was finished and dedicated and the king enthroned, the orderly operation of the temple would begin. That is, the ceremonies and services and rituals that accompanied it. So in the ancient world, all of the temples of the ancients had gardens, because mankind was created in order to feed the God in the ancient world. So he would cultivate and do all that was necessary to bring forth food in order to feed his God. But that's different for us, because God did not put mankind or Adam and Chava in the garden to feed him, but yet for them to provide for themselves. Obviously, God was the master, and it was his sustenance, but he enabled them to grow food and eat for themselves in order to have a relationship with them. In the ancient world, human, did not have a personal relationship with their God. Again, they were just there, mankind was just there to take care of the God's needs, to clothe and house and feed. But our God has established this, that we would have a relationship with him, and that there was a way to approach And so this all take place in the garden. So when we look at the cosmos and we see this entity in which God has created, and in the center of the cosmos would be the garden, and that is likened to the Holy of Holies. And just like in the garden, we have the trees in the midst of the garden representing the Holy of Holies, which was the throne of God. Same with the tabernacle and the first temple. The Holy of Holies was the place of the cherubim, the cherubim throne, and God sat, if you will, between the two. And that was represented by the world outside of time. So the garden essentially was the world outside of time, if you will, until Adam and Eve sinned and ate from the tree they weren't supposed to eat from, the forbidden fruit. But the main function of the garden or the land was to produce fruit, which is the main function and purpose for mankind also, to produce fruit, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This is all temple language once again. So the rest meant that God was in control, he was king, and life would come forth from him. We see, as I mentioned, this switching off in Genesis with the malachah, the work that requires to construct, and then avodah, the work that is service. And that avodah speaks of God's mastery over man, that he ultimately is the master and creator over the entire cosmos. And again, the complete rest that comes indicates that he is enthroned as king and that he is the rightful owner over the fields or over the garden, etc. Again, so we have introduced here in the sixth and then the seventh day, or the 7 years, we have the Shemittah, which means to withdraw. And so they withdrew from the land. And not so much, yes, there was an element in here where the land was because the soil would be depleted and weakened, and so taking a rest would help rebuild the soil. But really, the idea of the rest was for the sake of God and the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and really not so much in the spiritual application about the rest of the land, the rest that the land would take. The problem is we get into we assume everything in 7 year increments literally, although it can be literally, don't get me wrong, but the idea is that 7 was related to rest. The king sat on his throne, and things were consecrated and set apart. So we see on Yom Kippur in the 7th month, in the 50th year, after we have 7 years of 7, we now have 49 years, and on the 50th, that's our Yovel, and in which the land would be returned to the original owner. And it's very interesting that in the meantime, when one in Israel was caught in debt or couldn't afford the land for whatever reason, or to grow, they couldn't pay for the seed, or they didn't have a good crop or something, the kinsman redeemer would step in to purchase the land, but the original owner wouldn't get the land back until the 50th year. And so the kinsman redeemer essentially owned the land during all that time. It's kind of interesting. And let me just mention about Yovel, because we talked about the meaning, the idea of rivers and raging waters and enemies being defeated. One of the terms for Yovel is basically the gently flowing water. We contrast that with the raging seas, etc. And so that is this idea of release, and that kind of water is what brings wisdom and knowledge and understanding and the spirit, etc., in contrast to the raging waters. In reality, this is all speaking of the rest, God's rest, not for the sake of the land so much, but for the sake of God himself. And it is that God himself is the landlord over the land, and that Israel were his tenants. And this is the case in the garden sanctuary. Adam and Eve were essentially the tenants of the land. So when Israel entered the land, every family or clan was assigned a plot, and that land was supposed to remain in their possession. And again, if something happened and they came under debt or whatever, they had to forfeit the land for whatever reason, which was actually pretty common in the ancient Near East. Eventually, in the 50th year, it would be restored to its original owner. And so the redemption really spoke of the land that was sold that could be reclaimed. We have a much different idea of redemption, but in its most original and concrete meaning, it had to do with the land. And again, if there was crop failure, and one was forced to sell, the closest redeemer, the kinsman redeemer, would be required to intervene, and the redeemer bought it back, and they would have it until the Jubilee. It's kind of a picture to me of Messiah, if you will, having purchased the land, the temple, the place of the presence of God, and returning it back to the original owner, which would be God himself. So the Yovel has within it the idea of the seventh, the rest, the restoration to the original. And basically, that was Yeshua as Messiah. One of his roles then is to return the house, the temple, the place of the presence of God, back to the original owner, God, who is king to sit on the throne. He has possession of it, if you will, but he will return it. And that's the whole idea of the Shabbat and the enthronement and the established order. So this particular chapter perfectly encapsulates this idea, and hopefully it's been a help to you. We'll see you again next time. Shalom.